Welcome to this next video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Program. My name's Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for over 11 years now. I sit within the standard, regulation and thought leadership part of the organisation, and my role is to look at the impact of data and technology right across the built and natural environment, with over 110,000 members working worldwide right across the property life cycle through land, planning, development, construction, valuation, brokerage, finance, building operations and end of life. There's obviously a huge canvas upon which data and tech adoption is affecting the profession in a very positive way. And in addition, our members work across a whole different set of asset types as well, from land itself through residential, commercial, alternative assets and infrastructure. So once again, a hugely broad canvas upon which data and tech is having a very, very positive effect. And today I'm really glad to have Richard join me from eTool. So please do join me, Richard.
Thanks, Andrew.
Pleasure, great to have you on the call. And but before we get into the kind of the bits and the bytes and the data and the tech, it's great to have a bit of perhaps a human element here and a bit of a backstory on you and the team and the origin story of eTool, perhaps.
Okay, yeah, it's I guess it's a long one and it's up and down, but I'll try and give the quick version. So I grew up on a farm, so I was very exposed to nature and became aware of climate change, and it was called global warming back then. No, it wasn't. It was called the greenhouse effect, actually.
Yeah.
And then it became global warming, and then it became climate change, I think. But I became aware of it back then. It always troubled me, but I wasn't really sure how to act on that. And I actually ended up studying mining engineering at university. Yeah. So a bit of a different, obviously didn't dedicate my life to resolving climate change at that point in time, but and I had that sort of care, I think, for the environment in my career, but trying to do things better in that career, and I felt that was enough. And then there was a moment, and I've got a photo of that moment, yeah, actually, or pretty close to it, where things changed for me a little. I was on an expedition with a friend, just the two of us in the Canadian ice cap, yeah. And we skied down onto what was meant to be. Can you see my screen?
I can, there, yeah. A very impressive photo, yeah.
So this was meant to be a glacier, and we were meant to be standing on 40 meters of ice. The map was about 20 years old, and we were standing on a frozen lake. And I just remember sort of getting it all sorted, working out where we were, what we were meant to be standing on, what we were actually standing on, and then looking out on the lake, and there was that block in the middle, which I think is a block of ice from the glacier. And I thought, next summer, that's gone, and that was a moment for me where, because I kept informed about climate change and I became pretty convinced with the science, and then this was just very stark proof for me. And so I think at some point between then and getting back to civilization over the next couple of days, I sort of made the decision to, I guess, dedicate whatever talents I had towards helping out with that issue. So that was how it sort of that was how the shift really occurred. I got back from that trip, took a job in the solar industry, and met Alex Bruce, the co-founder of eTool there. And not long after we'd met, we got an opportunity to do the brief was carbon management for a new property development, and I think what they expected was operational. They wanted to be carbon neutral, and we sold them on the idea of life cycle carbon neutral. And then we didn't. We assumed there was some software that would enable us to do this quite cost effectively. And so, as a consulting job, that was a bit of a miss from a profit point of view. But we learned a lot. We built a model, and that was sort of the first. The first sort of prototype, I guess, of what eventually became eTool. Yeah.
Indeed. So, I mean, to almost summarise that, what is obviously a critical question here? What's the role of life cycle carbon within this whole ESG framework? Because clearly there's so much rhetoric around ESG, but when we zero in particularly on life cycle carbon, what's your view of the role and the criticality of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, and I'll try and answer that from two directions. So for me personally, I see climate change as a situation that nearly needs to be treated like triage. So in a medical sense, you arrive at an accident, an ambulance officer arrives at an accident, and there's a patient there with some sort of minor injuries, but they also have a life-threatening injury. You don't treat the minor injury until you've got the life-threatening injury under control. And I see climate change as the life-threatening injury for most of our ecosystems today. And so that's so I see it as triage. That's my personal view on climate change. So I care deeply about, I guess, many other environmental issues, but I do see them as somewhat redundant unless we can control climate. So in many cases. So that's the way I personally see it. I think in terms of the way environmental and social governance is being handled in the property sector, it's varied. You know, there's a lot of variation in terms of the criticality that people place on the environmental side of that versus the social, and within the environmental side, climate change specifically. However, I think the urgency around climate change is definitely on an upward trend. There's I think there's a realization that if an organisation isn't making a commitment that's in line with the Paris goals, then they can't claim to be environmentally and socially responsible any longer. And it's the same with governments. I think governments are in that same position as well. In order to maintain credibility with ESG, then climate change is now, or targets that are aligned with the Paris goals are sort of a bare minimum, I think. So I hope that answers the question.
Indeed. I mean, it's interesting, Richard. There was a recent article actually in The Economist that was almost kind of critiquing ESG and say actually the real focus, and I think this really echoes it for property sector, is to focus on the emissions, to focus on the carbon emissions, because there's a danger that by spreading it so widely that there isn't really the important focus on that emission and that life cycle carbon. I mean, given that the sector is perhaps unfairly sort of described as being so siloed across the life cycle of assets, how do we actually get thinking about emissions of carbon really embedded across that whole life cycle? Because as I say, unfortunately, the sector does have a reputation for thinking in silos at different parts of the life cycle. How do we actually get this whole life approach to looking at assets now?
Yeah, another good question. I think Charles Kedding said, "A problem well stated is a problem half solved." So, and I think that's the great thing about life cycle assessment, is that once you see where the impacts are occurring, it's very easy to start solving the issue. Okay, so, and I do think there is, even in the space of what we now know as life cycle assessment, just for new buildings, there's still this tendency to split things into embodied and operational, and try and achieve an embodied saving and try and achieve an operational saving. Now, I think when you're in a situation where it is emergency and it is triage, what should be happening is the financial resources that are available to address that problem should be allocated in the most cost-effective manner to address the problem. And that means you have to put all the data into one place and all your strategies to address that, and then weigh those strategies up against each other, whether they be embodied or operational or a mix of the two, or some trade-off between the two, and then understand where can I allocate my capital in the most cost-effective way to reduce the most amount of carbon. So I think, and that's in the new builds. In the existing building space, it's going to be much more of a interplay between refurbishment and embodied emissions with refurbishment, potentially end-of-life management as well, and operational emissions. But I think it comes down to financial. So the harder you push with your targets, the more impotence, the more motivation an organisation will have is to find those easy wins, and therefore the more motivation they'll have to take a broad view of where all their impacts are, and then find the easy wins rather than trying to hit certain goals in the silos. So as the targets get tougher, I think there'll be a natural tendency to look for the easy wins, and in order to do that, you're going to have to aggregate the data and cut the silos out. Yeah.
So given the kind of data and technology you're deploying now, how does this apply particularly for residential? Because there's an argument that there was to have a similar kind of outcome in terms of reducing emissions when you look at the kind of scale and granularity of residential stock in various countries compared to commercial real estate. They are very different kind of assets, and there's different kind of social, economic and political issues with looking at residential. What's your thoughts on, as I say, how you've addressed that from your technology point of view, and also generally with your experience in that sector?
Yeah, look, I'm really glad residential came up in the conversation, because I think there's been a lot of I think uptake in life cycle assessment through the rating schemes, which usually focus more on office buildings, etc. And interestingly for us, when Alex, my co-founder, and I sat down and worked out, should we stick to solar or do something with this life cycle assessment, thing that we've found. So that first project, very good feedback from the developer. They achieved a net zero outcome with our help, and that was life cycle. And we thought, does this have legs? And what we did a business plan to work out the economics of it, but we also looked at what kind of carbon we could save. And our back of the envelope there was looking at residential buildings, and it was enormous, and it was so easy. So small changes to those designs can, and I'm talking less than 1% increases in capital can reduce carbon by 30, 50%, over the life cycle. So, and we just looked at that and said, well, yes, we could continue in the solar sector, but there's this is not being addressed, and it's so easy. We should dedicate, some time to this. So that was our sort of original motivation. The tool that we built, we thought we were going to be able to address that market with, and it did reasonably well, but the price point was still too high. The consulting effort that went into it just wasn't going to scale in that residential sector, which is so cost sensitive. We have just recently released a tool because we never forgot about that sector. We never forgot about that opportunity, and we're looking at that now in terms of how we commercialize that, and a lot of early success with that tool. But the big opportunities we see in the residential sector, I think initially there's going to be a lot of uptake in the new building design. We actually we think the curve will be people making commitments, and that'll be governments and the private sector. They'll start benchmarking and measuring, and then trying to pick up the sort of easy wins in almost like a voluntary sense. Then we'll have regulations in new buildings. We'll then, I think, have at some point in the future regulations of existing buildings as well, and that might initially just be disclosure, but then later on might actually be standards if you want to sell or rent or something. But in between there, in that existing building space and residential space, there'll be, I think, a whole new market of finance that opens up for green loans, etc. So, yeah, there's a lot of easy opportunities for carbon savings in that sector. We're super excited to have that new product in that market, and for that reason, because of the carbon savings, and helping that market to decarbonise is something that we're really keen to do, and it's going to be a combination. You've got such a diverse ownership there in that. So first of all, it's build to sell. So that creates friction in terms of you spend more capital to create a lower carbon building. That might reduce operational energy costs, but the developer doesn't see the benefit of that. They have to somehow extract that value through the sale, which can be hard. And then you've got the owners who operate that building through its life cycle. And sometimes that'll be the people that actually live there. Sometimes it'll be a private investor, and sometimes it'll be public housing. So there's different parties. If it's public housing, it's almost a perfect candidate, because they do build and operate. So they'll see benefit from the operational savings if that's how the carbon savings are being achieved. So the really strong motivation for that, that stakeholder group, I guess. But I think there'll be, we think that the big movements here will be corporates and governments making carbon commitments, having to measure, having to reduce. That's really where we think and it comes back to your first question around ESG. Those carbon commitments are now sort of minimum standard. So
indeed. And Richard, where have you seen particular challenges where, as you're doing, you're working with different kinds of assets, and also even just from the perspective of Australia, you've got different regions, climates, weather conditions. What are the kind of challenges you've been bumping into, given that kind of heterogeneous nature of what you're trying to address, but with the same outcomes of reduced, life cycle emissions?
It's very hard to come across rules of thumb. If you do want to apply, rules of thumb for how to build a sustainable building across all those different scenarios. I mean, another one is just the density of the building itself as well, and there's all sorts of things that can just really move the needle so much on the carbon emissions of the building, and similarly where those easy wins are. So something that's a no-brainer in one context might be quite low on the list in terms of your cost abatement curve. How much it costs to abate that, those emissions in another sector. And I think that's actually, Alex and I, we're both engineers, and that's one of the things that really we found attractive about life cycle assessment was it was so flexible, and it did tease out those, it teased out the problem or the big, where the big hitters were in terms of carbon savings, regardless of all those characteristics. And they'd be different big hitters depending on those characteristics, but the life cycle assessment methodology teased it out, which I thought was pretty neat. So
I suppose from that perspective, because I guess the big challenge, given this kind of variable nature, is that if we're going to get meaningful targets and these strategies, whether they're for sort of small quick wins or whatever they are, to achieve them, my guess is without good data, it's going to be very hard to set these targets.
Yeah, I think absolutely, and I think I think there's a couple of things going on there. So one thing we've noticed is prescriptive methods very quickly lead to more expensive savings. And so coming back to coming back to what we sort of earlier spoke about in terms of deploying the capital most cost effectively, prescriptive methods fail in that regard. Not always, but there's, they very quickly start to fail as all those different variables start shifting around. And then you're leaving opportunity, you're missing opportunity to save carbon quicker or save more carbon or save the same amount of carbon at a lower cost, lower impact on society, so lower financial impact. So so we're definitely massive advocates for providing people with LCA tools that allow them to do it really quickly, so you don't have to fall back on a prescriptive method. And that new product, Rapid LCA, that we're looking at for residential, that's exactly what that's trying to do is put life cycle assessment into the hands of homeowners, everybody, So it's that for us, I think, is critical. You mentioned data as well. It's a good point, actually. So, I think what we have, like any challenge, the solutions need to be a process of continual improvement. And I think life cycle assessment is definitely in a state of continual improvement, and it's going to need to be in a state of continual improvement for a long time. And the big things I think there are, data, definitely, but even just standardization before that. So making sure the standards are solid, getting the data right, getting more product specific data and making sure that that's aligned with standards as they're improving, and then tools. So, and the last thing is industry knowledge, so training, etc. So bringing people up to speed. So there's a whole heap of moving parts there. There's no one solution that's going to nail everything, but we need to just continually improve everything. And I guess, yeah.
And Richard, I guess at the risk of introducing another moving part, how do you see the kind of interaction with all this with the various regulatory environments and government-led standards? I mean, is that a help or a hindrance? How do you see that? Because I guess you've got state level and federal level issues, obviously in Australia, and then obviously in different jurisdictions. There's a whole bunch of things now. And as I say, are they a help or a hindrance?
Oh, look at I think the government efforts generally have been very helpful. There's been a lot of very blunt instruments thrown at the issue of climate change around the world. There's been a lot of inaction, which isn't helpful. But the blunt instruments are still moving things in the right direction. But like I was saying, they're missing opportunity. So now, and the other thing is that the blunt instruments are only going to work when you can get the easy wins with the blunt instruments. So as it gets more challenging, you're going to need more innovative ways, more flexibility on terms of how you actually achieve your savings. And this is where I think life cycle assessment really comes to the fore, providing it's cost effective and easy, and it does actually tease out those easiest wins, and providing there's the quality and the assurance around it as well. So I think governments need to act. They need to act with the information and the state of the industry as it is today. And I don't think life cycle assessment has necessarily been mature enough in to this point where you can just go and legislate it. In fact, I think the only way you could really do that effectively is if you chose one tool as your method of standardization, because relying on the standards, there's too much flexibility in data, very difficult to build audit trails, etc. So I think, yeah, but that's now. I think we're getting more standardisation now. RICS have been part of that, and I think that, yeah, the industry, and we're also getting new releases of EN 15978 and EN 15804, etc. And so there's more opportunity for governments to regulate now, and we're seeing that. We're actually, we're seeing, I think, governments all over the world looking at life cycle assessment and seeing it as a sort of key tool to help decarbonise their economies, and that will come to the fore over the next 2 to 3 years, I think. Yeah.
Good. Now, I remember when we spoke before, actually, Richard, you raised an interesting kind of contrast between the words accuracy and precision when it comes to gathering data and looking at this whole life cycle piece. What do you mean between that difference of those two words? Because arguably people could think of them as being synonyms, but clearly there's a difference in terms of, sensible levels of accuracy and precision.
Yeah. So this was, this came to our knowledge during one of the pilots for that new tool that I mentioned. So our trajectory with our lifecycle assessment software was, let's stand something up. How do we then improve the efficiency of the takeoff, which I think most people recognise in the lifecycle assessment industry? That's the hardest part, is getting material quantities, energy quantities, etc., to actually produce your impacts. And we really saw BIM as the sort of holy grail there, and we started integrating with BIM. What we found, because we actually have a services team internally, and we're pretty analytical in looking at the time they spend on each of the tasks, etc., when they're doing an LCA. And what we found when we introduced BIM integration was we didn't get an improvement in the time to conduct an LCA, and there was a perception of accuracy because we were getting these exact quantities, and we had volumes of materials down to the nearest, cubic millimeter, etc. But what that was precision, but it actually wasn't accuracy. So in those BIM models themselves, we rarely saw the materials defined properly or defined at all. We rarely saw things like reinforcement modeled as a separate element within the BIM model. You just get a big rectangle, volume of concrete. And there's hundreds of examples like that. We rarely saw one model contain your structural and your architectural information. It was usually separate models for those different things. So all the data was there, but then trying to work out what you had to eliminate from each model to get a proper LCA with everything included, it all just takes time, and that actually, what you end up with is not a lot of time saving. So we kind of went back to the drawing board a little bit with Rapid LCA, this latest product, and we thought, what can we, in this residential sector, if we want to try and get an LCA done in 20 minutes, what's the minimum number of questions we can ask to still get an accurate result? So regression analysis on hundreds of LCA models, try and understand what those variables were, build our algorithms. But then the clincher was, so we got our, and this is where the precision versus accuracy light bulb came up for us. We started running pilots on this new tool, and one of the pilots was a low carbon challenge in Canberra, so that the capital here in Australia, and it was for architectural firms, and because they were architects and we knew they were across the details of their buildings, we encouraged them to enter the data, so enter the individual quantities for their wall areas, etc. And then we audited that, and what we found, so what we actually found was the user error in the entry produced more error than the regression so the original regression analysis would have given us a more accurate result overall than requiring the architects to enter things just because of the user error. So, and these were qualified architect, all registered architectural firms, etc. And so that was a huge eye opener. Is there's this sort of perception of accuracy? You want people to edit things and make it more accurate, but you actually end up with a less accurate result when you go back and order it. So, and I think that's that precision. Yeah. So perception of precision, but what it is precision, but it may not actually be correct. And
yes.
I think and this is something we used to say at eTool early on was we repeated. I think it was Warren Buffett said, "I'd rather be vaguely right than precisely wrong."
Exactly. Yeah.
And you see a lot of precisely wrong. Yeah, a lot of precisely wrong LCAs, and I think we're much more. We think it's much better to be vaguely right. And get a full scope LCA based on variables that you can be very certain of, and get certainty over, particularly over, I think, the design decisions that you're making as a result of that. I think that's probably the most important thing. Yeah.
And I guess it's a good example, Richard, of statistical approaches like regression analysis, almost sort of cutting through that signal to noise ratio and actually saying, well, actually, here's the signal. Everything else is kind of noise. These are the important issues that you need to look at. So I guess it's a shout out in that way to the power of those kind of techniques to really cut through that noise. I mean, moving on slightly to a linked topic is that there are clearly lots of different kind of certification rating methodologies across the world, and I think particularly of interest for those people in the UK listening to this, because it's beginning to come across to the UK now, is perhaps be great to get your view on neighbours as that kind of certification methodology, because there's obviously lots of talk about the various other certifications and the so-called performance gap between how you rate a building and how it actually operates. So it'd be great to hear your sense for somebody who's very close to neighbours about how that works and what the pros and cons of neighbours are.
Yeah. So yeah, Neighbours is an Australian program. I think it's been running for well over a decade now. I saw a great slide the other day from the crew at Neighbours, and it showed that the average energy saving for a building that's been Neighbours rated for 10 years is 30%. So these are buildings that are at least 10 years old. They've held a rating for 10 years, and the average energy saving for those buildings is 30%, which I thought was incredible. So these are existing buildings and they're saving 30%. And one of the drivers, probably not all the drivers, but one of the drivers is the fact that they've been reporting their neighbours rating. So the neighbours rating is, and the way it works in Australia is, if your building's above a certain floor area, you're required to have a neighbours rating in order to lease that building, and so they have to do it. They have to report it, and it is one of the things that tenants look at to make a decision on the property. There are some tenants that are very sensitive to that. Other tenants probably not so sensitive, but it's part of the decision-making process. Yeah. And it's probably part of the rent review process as well. Yeah. So it may actually affect the dollars per square metre that they end up getting for the building. So yeah, big shifts in energy use just from reporting. And I think there's a quote around that's not coming to my mind. But if the first step to performance improvement is measurement. You can't improve what you don't measure, and Neighbours is a great way of measuring and giving people that opportunity to improve. And we actually, so eTool, our head office is in a heritage building, over 100 years old. Pretty rare those age buildings here in Australia, but and it's got huge ceilings. It's quite a narrow floor plan, so a lot of natural light, etc.
Yeah.
And I was intrigued, like how does this building perform compared to the brand new office buildings, the big glass facades, etc. And so we recently did a neighbours rating, and it came in at 5.5 stars. We were hoping it would be 6 stars, and 6 stars is the top rating. But there's the majority of buildings that are going through, for example, Green Star ratings today are 5-star neighbours.
Mm.
And we've got this old heritage building that's got some sort of run-of-the-mill sort of average efficiency air source heat pumps, to provide the heating and cooling, terrible insulation, etc., and it's still achieving 5.5 stars. So that's another nice thing about neighbours, to just demonstrate that for all our technology today, we haven't come far in terms of building efficiency. So there's a lot to be said for thinking about how we use sort of natural resources such as sunlight and things like that a little bit more effectively as well. But neighbours doesn't necessarily tease that out directly, but we love being able to tell people that story, particularly environmental consultants that come to the building, and they're blown away, that the swanky new building that their office is in, that's got, all the bells and whistles, doesn't match it with this over 100-year-old building that hasn't put any effort into energy efficiency. So it's great. It's great for benchmarking, great for comparisons, and I think that you can't improve what you don't measure. It's stacking up. The numbers are there. It's sort of it's great to see. Yeah,
indeed. Well, that kind of naturally leads me on to perhaps my last question, Richard, which is, we're very conscious in most of the markets we operate that, as we've discussed, you can build new stock, you can use BIM models if that's appropriate to get some of the data. You can put, as you say, all the modern technology in, but we're very conscious that the biggest issue is kind of retrofitting the stock that's already built. And it's an obvious question to some extent, but what do what are those main challenges of getting carbon emissions down across an existing portfolio where there's obviously these capital constraints, and you're working with in your case assets that are performing well, but that's probably our biggest challenge rather than the new shiny buildings that are being built at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. I think in the residential sector as well. So I think we're replacing somewhere between 2 and 3% of buildings annually. Well, adding 2 to 3% of to floor area or number of dwellings or wherever it is annually. So on any given year, 97% of the stock is existing, at least probably 98.
Yeah.
So the existing building is a huge part of the story. You mentioned the word in the question, which was capital, right? And I think that's absolutely critical. So there's a big movement here called market forces, which is really pushing banks to stop funding projects that are risking a sort of 1.5 degree I guess maximum of warming, but also trying to get those financial institutions to put money into good projects, right? So, and banks are looking at that as well. They their boards are asking those hard questions. How do we direct capital into the climate action? So I think if there's that premium from an ESG point of view that's placed on that type of loan from the finance industry, and conversely, it's more expensive to get capital if you're not doing a sort of low carbon retrofit, then that's going to push things in the right direction very quickly. And I think about this in the residential sector, so I want to do if I want to do a retrofit just because I want my house to look prettier. I go to my bank manager and say, sorry, I just got a notification on the computer. I go to my bank manager and I say, I want some money to do a retrofit. And they say, oh, if it's a low carbon retrofit, the money's going to cost less, So, and so I think the capital is the key word there. And in order to sort of facilitate that, I think governments will probably lead the way without necessarily having the access to the cheaper money, but I mean, they control the flow of the money, so they probably do anyway. But certainly in the private sector, I think the cost of capital and as banks are willing to discount low carbon developments or retrofits, then that's going to be a big help, I think. Yeah.
Indeed. Well, it's been fascinating to chat today, Richard. Thanks ever so much for joining us, and I look forward to catching up again in the future.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, pleasure. Yeah, delighted to be asked, and pleasure speaking to you. It was fun.